The apocalypse that would devastate medieval Europe began thousands of miles away from Paris, in the windswept steppes of Central Asia. Modern-day Kyrgyzstan and northern China harbor a landscape of extremes, where endless grasslands endure harsh winters and blistering summers. Within this remote environment, an ancient killer had existed for millennia. Yersinia pestis, a bacterium of devastating efficiency that lived among the burrowing rodent populations of marmots and ground squirrels. For centuries, this deadly bacterium maintained a stable ecological balance with its animal hosts, far removed from major human settlements. However, during the 1330s, this delicate equilibrium shattered. Climate historians have identified a period of severe ecological stress, possibly involving drought followed by heavy rainfall, which decimated the rodents' food sources. Driven by starvation, infected rodents migrated closer to human settlements, bringing their plague-carrying fleas along. The fateful leap from animal to human occurred at trading outposts along the legendary Silk Road. The first human victims had no understanding of the horror unfolding before them. They developed raging fevers, violent vomiting, and terrifying swellings in their lymph nodes called buboes, which gave the bubonic plague its name. These painful symptoms marked the beginning of humanity's deadliest pandemic. News traveled slowly in the medieval world, but rumors of catastrophe moved faster than merchant caravans. By the early 1340s, fragmented and terrifying reports reached Mediterranean ports. Merchants spoke of entire civilizations in the east disappearing, of mysterious rains of fire and pestilence that left India, Tartary, and Mesopotamia virtually depopulated. Europeans listened with a mixture of horror and detachment, viewing these accounts as distant tragedies in exotic lands, perhaps divine punishment for foreign beliefs. Without knowledge of germ theory, they couldn't comprehend that the spices flavoring their meals traveled the same routes as their eventual executioner. The crucial geographical pivot point in plague history was the Crimean Peninsula and its magnificent city of Kaffa. This fortified, extraordinarily wealthy colony of the Republic of Genoa served as the vital connection between overland Asian routes and maritime Mediterranean networks. Behind massive stone walls lived Italian merchants, Armenian traders, and a cosmopolitan population protected by Genoese crossbowmen. In 1346, Kaffa faced siege by the mighty Golden Horde, a Mongol Empire successor state led by Khan Jani Beg. The Genoese, masters of defense and maritime resupply, maintained a brutal stalemate for months. Then disaster struck the besieging army. Living in cramped quarters with poor sanitation, the Mongol camps became perfect breeding grounds for the bacterium that had traveled with them from the east. Soldiers died by the hundreds, then thousands, their bodies blackening with gangrene before death claimed them. Watching his army disintegrate and facing certain defeat, Jani Beg made a horrific decision that altered history forever. In an act of desperate biological warfare, he ordered plague-ridden corpses loaded onto trebuchets and catapulted into the city. For days, dead bodies rained down on Kaffa. The psychological terror was immense, but the biological impact proved catastrophic. Bacteria from the corpses and plague-carrying fleas, seeking new warm hosts, infiltrated the supposedly impregnable fortress. Panic consumed Kaffa. Wealthy Genoese merchants utilized their greatest asset to escape, their ships. 12 Genoese galleys, loaded with refugees, cargo, and unseen deadly stowaways, slipped from the harbor, sailing past the dying Mongol army toward home. These vessels passed through the Bosphorus, skirted Constantinople, which would soon face its own devastation, and entered the Mediterranean Sea, Europe's economic engine and zone of intensive trade. The fleeing ships became vectors of death, docking at major ports to resupply and unknowingly seeding infection at every stop. The first major European port to succumb was Messina in Sicily. When the Genoese galleys arrived, dock workers witnessed a scene from hell. Contemporary chroniclers recorded that most sailors lay dead, their bodies rotting on deck, while the few survivors were delirious, racked with pain, and covered in black boils dripping blood and pus. Messina's port authorities recognized the danger too late and ordered the ships expelled. However, the true transmission agents, black rats ubiquitous on medieval ships, and the fleas on their backs, had already scurried down mooring ropes onto the docks. Messina became Europe's tragic test case. The infection's speed proved paralyzing. Close-quartered medieval port conditions accelerated transmission. Within weeks, Messina's social fabric disintegrated as people fled to the countryside, spreading contagion across the island. News of the Great Pestilence spread rapidly, prompting other ports to close their harbors to eastern ships. However, medieval quarantine measures were woefully inadequate. Greed frequently overcame caution, as ships laden with valuable spices could bribe their way into port. By early 1348, great maritime republics crumbled. Genoa, the home port of the ships from Caffa, suffered devastating losses. Venice, the queen of the Adriatic, faced an existential threat. The pragmatic Venetians eventually developed the Lazaretto concept, quarantine islands in the lagoon, where arriving ships and crews waited 40 days, 40 giorni, before city entry. This pioneering public health measure came too late for the first wave. Venice's gondolas became funeral barges, piling bodies high as they navigated silent canals. From Italian ports, the plague moved west to Marseille, France's great gateway, and crossed the Adriatic to Dubrovnik. Europe's coastal perimeter had been breached, and the disease turned inland. As the plague moved away from coasts, following river barges along the Rhone and carts along Roman roads, it encountered medieval Europe's dense urban heart. Cities like Paris, Florence, London, and Barcelona were walled enclosures of winding, narrow alleys, multi-story timber houses that blocked sunlight, and open sewers running down street centers. These vibrant, wealthy places were hygienic disasters waiting for catastrophe. When plague hit a major metropolis, it destroyed not just people, but the city's functioning as an organism. The terror of facing this threat without modern science cannot be overstated. The 14th century's best minds, including doctors from the University of Paris, were completely baffled. Their framework relied not on germ theory, but on ancient Greek theories of humors and miasma. They believed corrupted air, and possibly released by a planetary alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345, had unleashed noxious vapors from the Earth. Doctors advised people to avoid bathing, as it supposedly opened pores to corrupted air. They burned aromatic woods like juniper and rosemary on street corners to combat death's smell. They bled patients already weakened by disease and lanced buboes, which only accelerated septicemic infection. Every rational attempt to stop the plague seemed to feed it instead. The realization that their best knowledge was useless created a profound psychological crisis. Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed Florence's devastation, where approximately 60% of the population perished. His chilling accounts document complete social collapse. Contagion's terror was so overwhelming that humanity's most sacred bonds were severed. Boccaccio described fathers abandoning sons and wives, leaving husbands to die alone. The sick were walled inside their homes. Medieval life's intricate machinery stopped functioning. Laws went unenforced as magistrates disappeared. Courts closed. Bakeries stopped baking. The bustling city sounds, carts, shouting merchants, construction were replaced by oppressive silence, broken only by constant church bell tolling until the ringers themselves died or authorities banned the bells to prevent panic. The dead accumulated faster than burial was possible. Our consecrated churchyard ground filled completely, leading to massive plague pits where bodies were stacked like cordwood in layers, covered with thin soil. In the 14th century, no distinction existed between physical and spiritual worlds. An event of this magnitude could only mean direct divine punishment for humanity's sins of greed, pride, and corruption. The church, medieval life's bedrock, faced an impossible test. People flocked to cathedrals praying for deliverance, massing in processions that only accelerated the respiratory pneumonic plague's spread. When prayers failed and priests died as quickly as sinners, desperate radical piety emerged. The flagellant movement swept northern Europe. Hundreds of identically robed men marched from town to town. Twice daily in public squares, they stripped to the waist and whipped themselves with iron-tipped leather scourges, drawing blood in public penance, hoping to take the world's sins upon their flesh and appease God's wrath. This terrifying sight brought religious hysteria wherever they went. As death tolls mounted, the need for tangible scapegoats grew darker. If God wasn't listening, perhaps the devil was at work. A horrific conspiracy theory took root, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire and parts of Spain. Jewish communities were poisoning Christian wells to destroy the faithful. Despite official condemnations from Pope Clement VI, who noted Jews were dying equally as fast as Christians, mob mentality prevailed. Fueled by centuries of anti-Semitism and desperate blame, horrific pogroms erupted. Entire communities in cities like Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne were rounded up and burned alive. The Black Death unleashed not just biological horror, but humanity's darkest nature. The plague wasn't purely urban. While cities were epicenters, 90% of medieval Europe's population lived in the countryside, and the plague reached them too, carried by fleeing refugees and itinerant peddlers. Rural devastation was slower, but perhaps more profound in long-term impact. Thousands of small villages, now lost to history, were completely wiped out. The manorial system, dependent on steady peasant labor to work lords' lands, ground to a halt. Contemporary chronicles describe eerie scenes: harvests rotting in fields with no one to gather them, herds of sheep and cattle wandering aimlessly and turning feral, and wolves emboldened by human absence encroaching on remaining settlements. The carefully managed medieval landscape was being reclaimed by wilderness. By 1350, the plague had reached continental northern limits, Scotland, Scandinavia, and even Greenland's small settlements, dealing a death blow to Norse colonies there. It had burned through the entire continent, from the warm Mediterranean to the frozen north. By 1351, the initial catastrophic Black Death wave began burning out. The bacterium had simply exhausted easily accessible victims. The fog lifted, revealing a transformed continent. The exact death toll will never be known, but modern historians estimate between 75 and 200 million people died across Eurasia and North Africa. In Europe alone, perhaps 50% of the population perished in less than 5 years. Survivors emerged into a world that looked the same, but was fundamentally different. The immediate aftermath brought economic chaos and severe inflation. But then something remarkable occurred. Massive depopulation created severe labor shortages. For the first time in centuries, peasants held power. Lords desperate to have land worked had to offer higher wages and better conditions. Rigid serfdom structures cracked and eventually broke in many places. The golden age of the laborer had begun. Born from ashes, psychological scars ran deep. Art became obsessed with death. The danse macabre. The dance of death became a popular motif, showing skeletons dancing kings, popes, and peasants alike to the grave, a stark reminder that death was the ultimate equalizer. The Black Death was Western civilization's greatest trauma. It shattered the High Middle Ages' optimism and proved human systems' fragility against nature's power. The society that rebuilt itself was more cynical, more questioning, and forced to adapt. Ultimately, the path of death cleared ground for the slow, painful emergence of the modern world. For centuries, the Black Death was treated as a distant medieval nightmare. But empty streets, locked homes, fear of the air itself, does that really sound like ancient history? Or does it feel uncomfortably familiar? The plague was civilization's test. And tests have a way of repeating. Thanks for watching. I'm Mike, your guide through history's most pivotal moments. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, subscribe to keep history alive with us. Until the next era.